So hi everybody, I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. You are at the St. Louis Angular Lunch for October 2016. And for our presentation, I'm going to talk, well, hopefully somewhat briefly. We try to keep these at 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about managing state in Angular 2 applications. I had initially named some technologies in the title here, and then decided that what I feel like we need more is a talk about just the general sweep of managing state, and not so much a talk about the specific advanced technologies yet. We can maybe follow that up at a later talk. I hate about me slides, so this is a somewhat minimal one. You can tweet me, you can email me, and well, I spent a lot of time trying to make our curriculum reasonably okay at Angular Bootcamp. So if you want to learn about this stuff for 3 days straight instead of just for 20 minutes on this video, come sign up for Angular Bootcamp. I'm trying to give this reminder on every presentation I give. We are hiring instructors, developers. If you're really, really good, please come work for us. Okay, so my context today for talking about managing state in Angular 2 apps is this. We teach people who build typically big stuff, and we build typically complex things. This might not be representative of how you, the watcher or the attendee, is using Angular 2. We feel like, well, people who have budget to come to training or have budget to engage consultants, it's probably because they're doing something kind of complex. It's probably not because they're building something simple. So it's possible that we're just missing something here. It's possible the things that I'll describe as problems are problems which you might not have experienced yet, and you might not experience. I'm going to talk about the problems that we experience and that our customers experience building big, complex things. Okay. So the first question is, what is state in an application? Now, I think several of us here from our group, including Paul and I, as in the audience, have had interesting conversations about what constitutes state. And it's easy to look at things and say, oh, that's not state, that's not state. It turns out that over time, almost everything in an application that could change is ultimately state. So when I say state, I mean anything about an application that can change. So if a user clicks a button, whether or not they have clicked the button, that is state. When they click the button, that is part of the state. If there's a text field, if it has 2 characters in it, but it's not fully filled out yet, that's state. You can sort of think of maybe that's like an interim state, and then when you fill out the form the whole way, that's a full state, but still, it's state. If data arrives from a back-end system, that's actually state. The fact that data is on its way from a back-end system, that is also part of the state of a system. So depending on the level of complexity of a system you're building, there actually could be quite a lot of state in it. A given screen could have many, many, many aspects of its state, and an application with many screens could have spectacularly complex state. So where could that state be? I mean, the most obvious state would be in a imperative programming language is simply sitting in a variable. So that's where you most commonly find state. But state also, we also find state hiding lots of other places. So the URL, the route an application is on, that is part of the state of the application. If an error has happened, that is probably part of the state of an application. If a drop-down is dropped down, if a calendar widget is showing 2015, even though it's 2016, even though that you could say, oh, well, that calendar widget, that question of what year I'm looking at, that's local to the calendar widget. So I have the idea of local state here up on the slide. Well, that's still part of the state of an application. So there can be state hiding almost anywhere in an application. And again, nothing really even Angular specific here. Okay, so when we first start writing an Angular application, right, we read some documentation, we read some examples, we tend to store state within individual components, right? So Angular 2 components are stateful, and so we have state in those components. I've drawn that here. I have really, really lousy diagrams that I apologize for their lack of visual polish, but each gray box is a component, and each green box is a piece of state. So here we have a top-level component and 3 components used inside it, and there's just a little bit of state scattered among them. When we build applications like this, it's very simple to work with the state. If I was writing code, see if I can find a way to point here. I need a way to point. If I was writing code for this component, I can manipulate this local state by simply setting a field with a line of code in a method, right? So manipulating the state is very easy. But if I wanted to manipulate state up here, that's not so easy, right? So the downside is that if you think of each component in an Angular 2 application as just having its own state, then there's not really a way to even think about how these components interact, right? So a really challenging aspect of first stepping into Angular 2 is that this notion of each component just has its own state. That's really kind of what you learn when you pick up the docs, when you write your first component for the first time. So again, that looks conceptually like this. Now, in this example, each piece of the state appears only one place, and we'll see that change in future diagrams. But this is nonetheless a fantastic property. So when an application conceptually looks like this, the fact that each piece of the state is only in one place is really valuable. It means you cannot possibly be confused where the state is or what its value is, right? So maybe this top one here, maybe this is like a name you're filling in on some form on the screen, and maybe this is like a quantity and a tax percentage or something on a thing on the screen. Very easy to tell which piece of the state is where. I haven't even bothered to do this in code, although I do have some code examples I can pull up at the end if anybody says, I don't know what you mean by blah. Okay, so once we build a very slightly more complex application, we start saying, well, each component owns part of the state, but we use these Angular 2 binding and event features to move those pieces of state, to copy those pieces of state between different parts of an application. So I'll have a diagram here showing this idea. So for example, maybe this is the order quantity in a subcomponent, and maybe we need to display that order quantity somewhere in the top level component. And so this line right here, this represents an event binding so that this component down here can inform that component of the state of the order quantity so that it can be accessed up here. Now, there's a slightly scary thing happening here. The scary thing is we have more than one copy of some parts of the state. Right? So this maybe is the order quantity, and this is a copy of the order quantity, so it can be displayed or processed somewhere else. I actually showed this one being copied further down to here, and this time with this swoop you see here, the idea here is that quite often you'll have some piece of state in one component, and you'll need that state, that value, in a sibling component. And what you'll do is you'll write some code to propagate it up to the top level component and propagate it back down to that sibling component. I see some shaking of heads, and that's a good thing. I wish I saw people that worked with me shaking their heads. Heckling is permitted, by the way. We have a microphone in the room, so if we have a really good heckle, we can actually get it on the recording. Okay, so the challenge that you hit when you start simply putting state in different components and pushing it where you need it is that it gets difficult and it gets painful because you have to keep track as you code of which one is like the main copy of each piece of state and try to get the changes to go the right place. Now, it works, this works surprisingly well with Angular change detection. Angular 2 change detection is quite optimized. It's quite performant. It is amazing how much of a mess you can make with the state of a system and still get good performance out of Angular 2's change detection. However, as you do this, you realize you're actually kind of coding against the grain of Angular. So we'll see in a minute what I mean by against the grain of Angular. So here's the grain of Angular. Here's what they really want you to do, right? So give me a show of hands if you've heard this idea in bold before. Do you want to bind downward and have events go upward? That's not a real great percentage. Only about a quarter of the people in the room we're aware of this this Angular guideline. Can somebody tell me, does that appear in the Angular 2 documentation somewhere? Where is that idea most crisply expressed? Huh.
It's in the Angular 2 Tour of Heroes.
Okay, right. So we know it's discussed in the introductory kind of quick start tour of heroes. Like, is there, do you know of any official stance? The style guide expresses it. Okay, that's great. Okay.
Maybe Victor's.
Yes, right. Victor Savkin, very brilliant developer on the Angular core team. I know he has said something very close to these words. So, like, it's not just me making this up. This is, in a sense, how you are supposed to use Angular 2. Okay, so the challenge here is that changes get sent upward in events, but data only goes downward. You're not supposed to have data go upward. What this means is that although you technically can, when you're writing this program, you technically can change some data down here. You could edit some data down here, and then Angular 2 change detection could affect it up here, right? So if you really wanted to, you could, in fact, I'll even use this other example. This could be a piece of data. This is the official copy. This is the main copy. Then you could bind that object down to this subcomponent. Then you could edit the fields in that object in the subcomponent, and Angular change detection could show those new values in the upper component. Does that make it more clear what I mean? So I have some good nods in the room. So, but that is against the grain of Angular. You're actually supposed to use events explicitly to propagate change upward. So where we have ended up trying to follow this rule is building something, is hitting this pain point, is building something more like this, where the official copy of each piece of state gets pushed to the top of an application. And then if any other part of the application wants to make a change to that essential state, it must use an event to propagate it up. So we'll get back to our pain point slide. Okay, so this, raise your hand if you've ever kind of followed this rule a little bit. Anybody who's, yeah, okay, so I can tell who's been writing quite a bit of Angular code in the room, because when I ask about these things, someone says, yes, I've done that. This gets to be very miserable in several ways. The first is, you get what we call the Bucket Brigade. Has anybody ever seen what they would call the Bucket Brigade in an Angular application? That's where you have some data that's down in this component, and it's actually, the essence of that state is up in this component, and so you write a series of bindings of events to carry it up, and then you have some bindings to carry the data back down. All right, so you can end up writing many event and binding inputs and outputs and components to kind of carry your data one step along the way where it needs to be to get the essence of the state, the core of the state up to the top, but then to percolate changes all the way down. Now, if you do that, it fits the grain of Angular, it follows the official rule, it uses the on-push change detection. I won't go into why that matters in great detail, except to say, if you can use on-push and you're building a big complex app, it will go much faster. So it basically greatly reduces the amount of change detection that needs to happen. Now, the problem is, though, we get that Bucket Brigade, and then our modularity just goes out the window, because you end up where higher level components in a system have to be aware of all the details of the shape of the state that all the lower level components of the system need. It's very miserable. There's a special kind of misery I have as a last bullet point here, which is that as of, let me check the date, as of October 19, 2016, bindings and events are still untyped. There's no type checking. So we have this fantastic tool, TypeScript, to help us catch mistakes at compile time and development time, and that is still completely out the window anytime you touch an Angular 2 template. Angular 2 templates, essentially every single thing in every template is typed as an any. The reason I state the date for that is that this is rumored to change. Paul, do you remember who? There was somebody on the core team was even said something semi-public about this. It was like a...
If it was semi-public, it's probably Rob.
Yeah, I think it might have been. It might have, maybe. But so I've seen comments in issue trackers and on Gitter that a change might be coming as part of ahead of time compilation to make it possible for us to get type checking of variables that go in and out of templates. So my last bullet point here, in theory, could go away. So if you're watching this in December, it may be that it has already gone away. Might want to ask around. Okay, so you get this big pain point, though, when you do this. You push all your state to the top. If you have any data lower down, you have some data down here. If this data uses NGModel, you get this terrible, miserable thing that happens. I'm going to take a show of hands. Who knows what template forms are in Angular 2? Okay, just a few. Who knows what reactive forms are in Angular 2? Okay, so we don't have a group here who's done a lot with forms. So for the sake of those watching the recording, at Angular Bootcamp and in our consulting work, we've come to really 95% of the time recommend against using template forms. And that means against using NGModel. Right? So the interesting thing there is, like, is NGModel, is that a core feature of Angular 2? It should be at the top of your toolbox? That's what I thought. We actually, when NGModel first started working and everyone expressed great relief that, two-way binding is back, NGModel is back, we started teaching it eagerly. We started showing it to students like on the first day of a class, getting people into NGModel. The more we've built applications, the less we use NGModel. And I actually now recommend just, making something simple maybe, but if you're building a serious application, I would suggest you take NGModel and put it back in the toolbox and just leave it there and never get it out. The reason why is that NGModel two-way binding, that does things like edit the data down here. So if this right here is two-way bound, then you'd be having some data which you thought was owned at the top of your component hierarchy, but it is bound down with a square bracket binding down to here. And then this local copy is getting changed by a two-way binding. All right? I see nods, which means people have experienced the misery of this. Then you realize, like, what does an Angular one-way binding even mean? You see some really great conversations on Stack Overflow and on the Angular issue tracker where people are trying to get their head around what an Angular 2 one-way binding, downward data binding means. And people want it to mean ensure that this variable is always the same as this one. And that's not what it means at all. All it means is when change detection runs and detects a change to this value, push it down to this value. So if you write code in an Angular 2 component that changes the value of some field that was bound in from above, you're kind of off on your own as to what that even means. So if you do a two-way binding to one of those, you end up with hackery like, well, we know that sometimes this local value will get overwritten, and so let's do some change detection and then call an event to go sometimes try to catch that and write the value back up here. And that's what I describe as the pain point you hit when you use NGModel. It does not scale well, the complex things. Okay, so continuing onward, we reach a point where this is just too miserable because we're doing too much bucket brigading, we're passing data up and down too far. So we say, well, we have dependency injection. Many of us in the Angular 2 world came from the Angular 1 world, right? And the standard answer we did in Angular 1 was, well, you make a service, and it's a stateful service. It's got some variables in it. And you put your data in there. Don't put your data just floating in your controllers. Like, the thing that owns the data of your application should be services. So we do this. We just yank that data, yank the official copies of the data out of the components, and we stick it in the services. And I drew these a little bit differently because what I mean by this one is, don't make a copy of the data, just literally bind to the service. You could have a field here that's bound directly to the service. So if you do this approach, you kind of still have that change detection problem thing if you use NGModel, but still you get some nice benefits back. So we can get modularity and scalability back. We can build a much bigger thing because we're not like bucket brigading each piece of data all over. We have the dependency injection system making it obvious where the state is used. This is really, really helpful, right? If you have a service that has the, pending order state in it, you can ask your IDE where all that service class is referenced, and you can instantly see what all components of your application are using the pending order state, which is a great feature you get back. But we still have lots of problems, right? So we've built projects to this stage, and here's the pain we sent. Well, you're still relying on change detection. You can't use that on push anymore because you have this thing where you're like changing a value in a service, and Angular 2 doesn't really even have an official kind of top level feature to talk about a service bindings. There's no thing as like binding data into a service. So you're basically just sticking data in a service and you're relying on change detection to make it appear on the screen. Sometimes to get around some problems with that, you end up actually injecting your service data one level up in your component hierarchy. So you can use Angular to bind it just that very last step. And then you can, I see smiles and nods, so well, you've done this. And then the number one thing that happens if you do this is my last bullet point, which is that when you're feeling desperation and you find yourself online trying to figure out where scope watch went, it's probably because you're doing this, right? So you can raise your hand and confess if you have wanted scope watch back. Only one in the room would admit it, but I'm sure there are many, many more. But ultimately, just having your state sitting in variables and services still has many, many problems. It goes against the grain of Angular. I didn't even bother to mention that one. It doesn't let you do change detection correctly and so on. So this is what that stage of a systems development looks like. Okay, so you've been in this thing for a while. You've been using Angular for a few months, and you finally got your head around the Observable API. I should plug our class. If you come to our class, use the Observable API much sooner than 3 months into your Angular journey. You realize what you really need to do is you put your state in observables. And then you can get the state back out of observables onto the screen by using the async pipe. Can I get a show of hands for who's used the async pipe? Just want to. Oh, you got to use the async pipe. You got to use the async pipe. So, okay, so you get the modularity, you get the scalability, you get the obvious dependencies. You can use on push because if the data arrives by observables, with the async pipe, on push will do just the minimum update necessary. You don't need like the full change detection. Most importantly, these observables, they give you a place to write code that is business logic that is not tangled up with Angular. And so you avoid this temptation to put business logic in an ng on changes because you can actually subscribe to your state and you can like do business application level stuff there instead of feeling like you have to get tangled up with the Angular API for that. You get this great testability. The downside is you'd end up doing a bunch of work. So we've seen this happen. We've done this. You kind of start for managing state as services and observables. And yeah, sure, I mean, it's great. We all love writing frameworks. Has anybody heard the quip? What's the difference between a framework and an application? Does anybody know the quip? Well, an application is something that someone who has a budget actually wants. And a framework is what a developer does while they're avoiding building the application. So yeah, I love writing my own frameworks to solve problems, but still, it's not great, right? Because you build your own thing, you don't have any off-the-shelf tooling, you have no community, you're totally off on your own, you hire new people, and they say, what is this, right? I didn't even bother to draw a diagram for that one because it looked the same. So here's where I think we all should ultimately end up. And that is, kind of just as succinctly as I can, if you're building a non-trivial Angular 2 application, you need to figure out which of the various off-the-shelf, high-quality state management libraries you like, and go use that. So you get all the benefits of rolling your own, putting state in observables, but you pick one of these libraries, you write less code because you're using code somebody else wrote. Several of these libraries have really nice tooling available to actually let you work on changes, like see changes happening with some little tool in your browser. You get a community to be part of. You can actually ask a question and someone might give you an answer, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Really, the only meaningful downside is that there's another thing to learn on your project. I skipped the kind of interim downside is you have to choose one, right? Because like this is a downside, but once you've made the choice, people joining your project only have to learn the one you chose. Like you don't choose a new framework every time someone joins a project. Okay, so I've intentionally kept this very very vague. Like state library, what are you talking about a state library? This is because I think the jury's still out on what is the very best one to ultimately use. Here are the ones that I think are at least initially worthy of consideration. If you like the Elm architecture, which is to say if you like the Redux pattern, I try to always say Elm architecture first because it appeared in Elm before it appeared in Redux. But if you like that, there's at least these two great choices. So there's this tool called NGRX Store. This was written by, I think at least part of the team working on NGRX Store are people on the actual Angular 2 core team. Is it part or all?
I think all of the members working on NGRX, the core members of NGRX, they are a member of the Angular 2 core team.
Okay.
There are a few that aren't, but the core members, yeah.
Okay, so the core members, people working on NGRX Store, are people working on Angular 2. So there is a very high probability of it closely matching kind of how you're supposed to use Angular 2. If you want to be a little bit further to the weeds, you really like Redux itself, there's a thing called ng2 Redux, which is an adapter. It's slightly messier because you're kind of living in these two worlds, but it's really not bad. The adapter is quite good. If you want to write straight Redux code, it is very feasible to use this. I've talked about doing like a detailed talk and actually walking through how to use Redux, and I'm told that another group here in St. Louis actually had a talk on that topic recently, so I don't know, maybe go find that video and watch it, or stay tuned to this channel, and probably one of us will give an NGRX Store talk eventually. If you don't like the Redux pattern, if you find that just too tedious, there's some other possibilities. So one of them is this, like a Firebase. Firebase is this really brilliant thing from Google. It's a backend as a service, and obviously Firebase itself is only suitable for projects who are comfortable having all their data kept in a backend as a service. But I think there are some brilliant ideas in there, and I think we're going to start seeing, excuse me, ideas that are visible in Firebase. We're going to see those ideas appear in various locally deployable databases because the ideas are just so good. A side effect of those ideas is that essentially it ends up taking over most of the state of your application. So you can build an application where you have, I didn't bother to draw a diagram for this one, but where you have several components and each of them is binding their data to Firebase, and so Firebase propagates the data among the components. So many of the problems that you might have to solve yourself in terms of propagating a state around an application actually go away if you're delegating the state to Firebase. And the slick thing there is that Firebase is then handling your local state transparently with the overall state of the entire system, spanning dozens or hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of users. So that's pretty brilliant. It's just a very, very quick diagram for those not familiar. If you're using NGRX Store or Redux, your state basically works like this. You make this one kind of solid congealed structure that has your entire application state in it, and then every piece of the application that needs it subscribes to the part of it they need, and then changes to it percolate in as a sort of queue coming in the top. And again, I'm not going to try to actually go over that here. There's other videos, or stay tuned, but that's the basic idea behind Store. If you're willing to step slightly farther away and not only look at things that are kind of Angular 2 ready, so here are a couple of things to be aware of if you're willing to be a little bit more at the bleeding edge, we would call it. Over in the React world, oh look at that, a nice typo. In the React world, there's a tool called MobX, which used to be called Observable, and I do not know why the name changed. It's getting a lot of attention as a more convenient alternative to React, to Redux. The one real challenge with Redux or Store is that writing the code that converts these changes into actual changes in the state can become quite tedious, and I think we've experienced that, and many others have talked about it. The MobX folks are kind of taking that problem head on, taking a little bit different approach, but still preserving, I think, at least 80% of the benefit of Redux is preserved with going to MobX. There's research. It's actually research by somebody at Microsoft, I believe, about something called the state action model pattern. And I believe it actually has some echoes of MobX in it, but this is worth a read. I don't know of anything that purports to directly implement exactly this yet, although I imagine there probably will be. But again, it's similar to what Redux achieves, but aiming for a little bit more convenience of coding. If you really like Elm, there is a library out there. I was unable to find it to put the link up here, but there's a library here that will let you write all of the core application logic of your application in Elm and then use any JavaScript-based framework to render it. So in theory, you could write all your state management in Elm and then display it with Angular 2. And then lastly, Andre Staltz, he makes a thing called CycleJS. And I would encourage you to watch any talk of his you come across. Really, really sharp guy. He argues that we actually have a lot of things we don't need in these things, and that observables really get us most of what we need to manage state, and that you could actually think of the entire state of an application as an observable function of the inputs to the application. And so I don't know that you would even necessarily need a framework to do that, but it's possible to take this idea quite far, to basically use observables to aggregate up all the things that have happened into one observable, and then chain off that observable to cause all the effects you want to happen. And you can basically, if you're willing to learn and reason about and use observables pervasively enough, you can basically use that as your way of managing state. And that has some really nice payoffs. There's actually a competitor to Angular and React called CycleJS that pretty much does only that. Its scope is kind of considerably smaller than Angular, for example, but for the thing it does, it's really pretty brilliant. So I would advise learning a little bit about it, even if you never use it. So a key question is, how big does my application have to be to care about all the state management stuff, right? I mean, there's obviously a lot to think about, a lot to do. This sounds like a lot of work, a bunch of libraries, a bunch of crap to learn. Why would I do this? So our reasoning here is basically, if your application is big enough that you're bringing this huge artillery to the table, right? You're bringing this Angular 2 thing. It's big, it's complicated, it's for building big things. We're not even using JavaScript, we're using the thing with a type system. Our problem we're solving is big enough that we need a type system to help us not make mistakes. We need a system that has nesting and injection and lazy loading, right? So our basic reasoning is, if you're building something big enough that you really need to be using a platform as powerful and scalable as Angular 2, then you almost certainly are going to have enough state that you need a state management system. So I really think that over the next couple of years, we're going to coalesce on essentially most or all substantial Angular projects using one of the various state management systems. I would even dream that maybe one day one of them might even make it into Angular itself, if we can get that lucky. I do want to give a little bit of credit to an alternative point of view. And anybody who doesn't recognize this, this is Ward Bell. He is a really experienced, really smart guy, and he's one of the key writers, possibly the key writer, of the Angular 2 documentation. And he feels like explicit state management, the kind of stuff I've been talking about, is and will be needed only on a fairly small slice of Angular applications. So I would say in my world, 90% of Angular 2 applications probably need explicit state management to be their very best, and he would probably say that maybe 10% of them need it to be their very best. So my point of view is not the only one. I do want to, kind of tip of the hat, maybe of the red hat, to Ward for having he can make a pretty compelling argument about how you can get pretty far without any of the sophistication that I'm talking about. I do want to make a couple wishes before I wrap up. One is, I really wish we had stateless components. Because you think back to my diagrams that I won't flip back to, as your application becomes sophisticated, you really don't want state to be in your components. And if we had a way of making components that didn't have a place to put any state, that would be really, really nice. The React people have this. I feel like we should be able to get this. Maybe in Angular 3 or 4, whatever, however, they have this new semver thing. So I think we're talking about next year for 3 or 4. Is that right? So maybe somewhere around there we'll get stateless components. And while I'm wishing, React has a thing called higher level components, which greatly kind of let you automate the wiring between a state management system and a component. It's not quite clear how to do this in Angular, but I would love to pick up something like this in Angular. It'll look differently than it does in React, but it would be just brilliant to get something like this in Angular. Reminder that we're hiring. Please contact us. You probably can find us online using this information. And thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to take a Q&A here, and we will try to record the Q&A so we can include it on the video. So. And we have we can talk for about 12 to 15 minutes without going over our lunch. So go, yeah.
Sure, so obviously if we're using libraries to do something like the example you mentioned, the calendar that pops up, and as the menu of the calendar is open, that state of that isn't going to be maintained in our global state, even if we do go to the final form of this design.
Right.
So is that just for libraries we're building, or if you were building your own component that did something like that, would you imagine that the state for that would also not exist in the component, but the kind of internal state of how a component displays would get dumped into your global state?
So I guess I don't need to repeat the question because we have a solid audio recording of it. The challenge is that whatever aspects of state you decide are going to be component local, right? And whether those you decide they're component local because you're like everybody else, you can't resist the temptation to bring in a jQuery plugin for your, I don't know, what does everybody need, right? A calendar,
sure.
Stupid calendar date selector. You know what we really need is a better calendar selector. There's not enough of them. There's only about 4,000 out there on the web. We need that 4,001st.
I'm going to write my own.
And, so the challenge is that some of those widgets you want to bring in and reuse can have quite a lot of state in them. And so typically what you'll do is you'll decide to take most of that state and ignore it and just let it be local to that thing. The problem is now you don't have controller management over it. And so basically you only need to dig inside and find a way to make the state of a component explicit in part of your overall application state if you need to manipulate it. But if you don't mind losing control of the manipulation, then it's not that big a deal to say, well, yeah, we're not going to bother to globally manage the state of what year the calendar is looking at.
Sure.
So there's a flip side to Kyle's talk that he just gave, and that's talking about the actual consumption of these state systems.
Yeah.
And that right there would be like an entire new talk about
yes.
the smart view component pattern.
Yes.
And how huge a role it plays in coupling with your state management.
So I think what we're hearing here live is Paul Spears is volunteering to give a talk coming up on the smart display component pattern. So stay tuned to our channel for that.
Yeah, so that really comes into play with the kinds of things you're talking about. With like, all right, I got this big idea of state from my application. Like, what about the local copies? And what you see there is like when you put the smart view component pattern in play, all of your components then like recapture a sense of local state, and so you make a per component decision every time about, do I emit this up or not? And it actually becomes a really, really natural and easy to find where those boundaries lie when you look at it that way, because you have already made the decision to choose what state to emit, regardless of what state system, global state system you're using, because you're managing that handoff between your view component and your smart component that wraps it. Right. So you've already made the decision there. It's like if it was worth emitting to the smart view container, then it needs to be in the global state, and you're already done.
Okay, so it's like a public and private state, essentially.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of think of it that way. More questions? I'd love to hear some experiences from people who I know who are building big, complex things. Can we get an anonymous off-camera experience report? Maybe without saying any names of companies?
Well, just
where is your group in my progression of
there's a specific part of the application that we've rewritten about 5 times, and we're in the process of rewriting it again.
Cool.
And we've definitely went stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. And since we're in the process of rewriting it, we were both thinking that we might just try to jump to stage 5.
Yeah, I sure wouldn't stop here.
We're starting on stage 4. We have.
You have an observables?
we called event bus that has like 10 observables in it.
Okay, so yeah, so you're building this.
That is true. I didn't
Yes.
know that,
So
yes.
my advice is to do this instead.
Yeah, but we definitely, and it's been ugly, and each time we come to it, and we have some of the stuff, like I spent a few days, a couple months ago, making our service completely stateless and putting everything up to the component, and then last week I pulled it down and she had made some changes and she had put all the state right back in the service, because it never
Right.
feels right anywhere that we've done it. So yeah, we've definitely kind of gone through this, and I've heard several of the podcasts about Redux and NGRX, but I haven't paid enough attention to them because I needed to watch this presentation
Sure.
first.
I mean, the summary is you're very deep in the Angular ecosystem. If you don't have a clear vision for one of them, pick up Store and start using it today. Would be my advice.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I'm in the middle of a bunch of other stories this week, but next week probably I will.
Yeah.
As far as
Yeah.
you versus Ward Bell, I just want
There's no me versus
Well,
Ward
no,
Bell.
no.
Ward Bell is so much more awesome than I could ever dream of being. First, I don't have any clothes to compete with Ward. Yeah.
we have a very large application, but only the section that he's talking about actually does a lot of data entry. So that's really the only place that we felt the pain. So our kind of passing, a mix of probably stages 2 and 3, and the rest of the application has been fine for us because there's not a lot of changing data. It's a lot of viewing of stuff mostly.
Sure.
And so really we've only felt that pain in this one section, which is actually not being split out into a separate app.
So
I will say, add on that, part of the reason that we didn't feel it in the main part of our application is whenever we make a change, we reload the screen.
That's cheating. No, actually, I can talk about that a little bit. The question is, should you, as you progress, do you only rewrite a screen at a time to use whatever you're going to use, or do you make your whole application use it, right? That's kind of the trade-off. So where we started out was being selective, right? We kind of did the simplest thing for each part of the system that worked for that part of the system. What we have found is that, firstly, that means that as we go look at any piece of code, we got to think for a while, figure out what are we supposed to do in this file? Which thing am I doing here? And then the second is it gets really painful where they touch. So what we have decided, this is more of like a train falling off a cliff, and once one car goes off the cliff, they're coupled together, so eventually they're all going to go off the cliff. And so we feel like once you have picked out how you truly want to do state management, you're probably going to eventually do that application-wide, eventually. Yeah?
I have a question. So we have sections of our application that have completely different data. Do you have multiple stores?
So we really need to have someone, maybe not me, do a talk about these things in detail. But yeah, certainly with either of these Redux-like things, there's a single store. But that store is an arbitrarily complex object. So it can have many, many sub-objects in it. So you can still reason about it. You can still manipulate it as a single thing, but you can also manipulate any individual piece of it as you need to.
So like as you go from one route to another, you just clear out what's in the store and start putting
That depends on whether you consider the stuff that's on the other screen you're not on part of the state of the application. Whether you're okay having to reload it, right? You might decide that, well, locally you don't need that list of search hits anymore because we've moved on to another screen, and so we're okay zeroing out that list, and we're happy to perform a new search if the user navigates back. Or you might decide that you're going to leave that in the state, and then you could create a feature later where maybe one screen ended up combining both. More questions? Comments, ideas?
So have you heard any further information from the Angular team themselves as to what kind of opinions they state on this beyond what's in the little intro documentation?
So,
Their stance on state management.
as far as I can tell from anything, the question is what does the core team think? How do they think state management should work? It seems like the official information has been those hints about you're really supposed to bind down an event up, and that Angular 2 is very much trying to be multi-paradigm. So it's trying to be unopinionated. It's trying to be compatible with people who want to do all of these different kinds of state management. So I would describe it as you get farther up this layer of advancement, you're more reaching kind of the essence of truth that's deep inside there somewhere, and that the answer is inside Angular. You just have to look at it more closely. But I really think the official answer from the core team is no stance yet. Maybe we'll talk about it in a future version, but for now it is explicitly multi-paradigm, I think. And that's, I can't point you to words that officially say that, but I've seen things flow by in the various channels that point me to that. I would say, I don't know, that's a good thing to ask, right? Maybe that's something somebody needs to ask more firmly at the next roundtable they have at a conference or something, and try to hear a little more of the official vision. And of course, if we see any of these solutions start to emerge even a little bit in a future dot release, we'll know, right? More questions, comments? Okay, well, let's wrap up the recorded part here, and everybody's welcome to stand around and chat for a while as long as you want. Thanks for coming, everybody.